Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into something that probably sparks an immediate image in your mind. Gang behavior in schools.
Hmm.
We've got a fascinating piece of research as our starting point, a 1995 review article called Gang Behavior in the Schools, Reality or Myth
Hmm.
by Carolyn P. Parks.
Right.
Our mission is to really get under the skin of what the research from that time was saying and figure out how much of what you might assume about gangs and school violence actually held up when people started digging into the data.
Exactly. This isn't about just repeating what we've heard. Park's review was like a forensic examination of the research that existed back then, specifically looking for solid proof, what we call empirical evidence, that directly linked gang behavior to violence in schools.
Yeah, trying to separate fact from fiction.
Pretty much, in a really complex area.
And right off the bat, here's something that might surprise you. This review actually found a lack of strong empirical evidence directly connecting school gang violence as a major cause of overall school violence in the mid-90s.
Yeah, that's a big one.
So, despite what you might assume from news reports or even fictional portrayals, the research at that time wasn't strongly backing that direct link as the primary driver of the problem.
That's a key insight that challenges a lot of the common perceptions. Media often focuses on the more dramatic connections, and I'm sure many of us have a picture in our heads shaped by those stories.
Yes, Shelley.
So the fundamental question we need to explore is, were those widespread assumptions accurate then, and what might have changed or not changed since?
Okay, let's unpack this lack of strong evidence.
Mm-hmm.
One of the first big obstacles Parks identified was a really basic one, a clear definition.
Uh-huh.
Back then, and even to some extent today, there wasn't a single agreed-upon understanding of what exactly constituted a gang problem, a youth gang, or, most importantly for our focus, school-related gang behavior.
What's fascinating here is why that definition was so elusive. Parks points out that until the mid-90s, when the National Youth Gang Information Center was established, there wasn't a national body consistently collecting data on gang activity.
Right, no central hub.
So naturally, different researchers and local authorities were using their own definitions, leading to a very fragmented understanding of the issue. The key insight here is that this lack of a common definition makes it incredibly difficult to compare research findings and draw broad conclusions about the problem.
And it sounds like the media definitely added to the confusion. Parks describes how initially there was almost a romanticized image of gangs, especially based on the New York experience.
Yeah, like West Side Story almost.
Right. Then, as gang activity seemed to increase, the portrayal shifted to something much more sensational. This probably muddied the waters for everyone trying to understand what they were actually looking at.
Exactly. Those shifting and often exaggerated media images can significantly shape what the public believes and can even influence the focus of research. If the very definition of what we're talking about keeps changing or is presented in a highly dramatic way, it's almost impossible to establish consistent research and get a clear picture.
Right. And this problem with defining what a gang is directly impacted the research itself. Parks highlights a real shortage of studies that specifically looked at school-related gang behavior.
Yeah, that's crucial.
There was plenty of research on general street gangs or gangs in particular regions or among specific ethnic groups, but very little that focused on what was happening inside school buildings.
If we connect this to the bigger picture for you, it means that a lot of what we thought we knew about gangs in schools was based on either individual stories, anecdotes, or theoretical ideas, rather than solid research looking directly at that intersection.
Right.
Schools were often seen as separate from the street, so the idea of gang turf extending into the classroom might not have been the primary focus of earlier studies.
Parks mentions the work of Miller in the early 1980s and again in the 1990s as one of the few attempts to create a national definition that included school violence.
Yeah, Miller's work pops up a lot.
And then there's the work of Arthur and Erickson in 1992, which was full of passion and offered some interesting ideas, but was entirely based on those individual stories, those anecdotes.
Those firsthand accounts, like in Arthur and Erickson's work, can give us valuable insights into the lived experiences of individuals. But for us to understand the broader reality, how widespread these issues were, we need more systematic research that looks at a larger scale.
So why was there so little research specifically on school-related gangs? Parks points to several challenges. One major one was just the difficulty of doing this kind of research.
Definitely.
Getting gang members to cooperate with researchers is a huge hurdle.
And let's remember the inherent power dynamics at play here. As Parks mentions, the majority of gang members tended to be young people of color from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, while researchers often came from different backgrounds.
Hmm.
This can create significant barriers to building trust and getting honest information.
Absolutely. There's also the fact that much of the gang research relied on people reporting their own activities or on researchers observing behavior, both of which have their limitations.
Right, self-reporting isn't always reliable.
People might not always tell the truth, and what a researcher sees can be influenced by their own perspective. Plus, there was a tendency to rely heavily on what law enforcement reported, which might give a biased view focused on criminal activity.
That's a crucial point for you to consider. Law enforcement's job is to focus on crime, which might not capture the full picture of gang-related behaviors within a school.
Yeah.
They might miss the more subtle forms of intimidation or influence that don't necessarily lead to arrests, but still impact the school environment.
And then there's this really interesting point about potential underreporting by school staff. Parks suggests that schools might have been hesitant to report violence and gang activity to protect their image.
Oh, definitely. Reputation management.
That could definitely skew the data we have access to. So the official numbers you might have seen likely paint an incomplete picture, masking the true extent of the problem within school walls. That's a critical point to remember.
It creates a real challenge for researchers trying to get an accurate understanding. If schools are reluctant to report incidents, the official statistics might significantly underestimate the actual level of gang involvement and related violence.
Finally, Parks points out that a lot of the key research on gangs was actually quite old, with many major studies done before 1975.
Yeah, dated stuff.
This was despite the feeling that gang activity and violence had increased since then, with the emergence of what were called new youth gangs. That time lag is crucial.
Totally.
If the nature of gang activity was changing, then relying on older research might not give us an accurate understanding of what was happening in schools in the mid-90s.
It's like trying to understand today's technology using only information from the early days of the internet.
Exactly. Bad analogy, but yeah.
Okay, so even with these challenges in defining gangs and studying them in schools, the research from the mid-1990s did give us some insights into what gangs generally looked like. Parks draws on surveys like Miller's, which estimated around 1,400 gangs with about 1.5 million members in cities with over 10,000 people.
Wow, 1.5 million.
That's a huge number, and it really highlights the potential scale of the issue for communities across the country. And a significant portion of adolescent boys in these communities were involved in groups that engaged in illegal activities, ranging from things like drinking and drug use to theft and more serious crimes.
And these gangs were predominantly ethnically homogeneous, urban, and made up of males from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, with African American and Hispanic youth being the main groups.
Right, that was the prevailing image.
But it wasn't just a big city problem anymore. Gang activity was spreading to smaller cities and even suburban areas and was suspected to exist in all 50 states.
Yeah, the geography was shifting.
This geographical spread suggests that the factors contributing to gang formation weren't limited to just a few types of communities.
The typical picture of a gang member that emerged was a male between 13 and 24 or older, with an average age in the early 20s, coming from a low socioeconomic background and identifying as a youth of color. The reasons why young people joined these groups were complex, including things like social disorganization, which refers to communities where traditional social structures are weakened, institutional failures, racism, cultural traditions, opportunities for crime, and a lack of supportive networks, not to mention the presence of existing gangs which can exert their own influence.
The whole mix of things.
Ultimately, what becomes clear is that gang involvement isn't about a single factor, but a convergence of failures across school, family, and community systems, highlighting a deep-seated need for belonging and opportunity that isn't being met.
Miller, as Parks points out, identified 6 key elements that tended to characterize these gangs. They had a structured organization, identifiable leadership, they claimed a territory, there was ongoing association among members, they had a specific purpose, and they were involved in illegal behavior.
Right, those core elements.
Longer has added to this, emphasizing that these were usually groups of adolescents and young men, that routine criminal behavior was involved, that there was often organized planning of activities, and that ethnicity and social class played a role in their formation.
What researchers like Miller were trying to do was establish clear markers. For you, think of these as the key ingredients that turn a group of kids into something more organized and potentially harmful things, like a specific leader and a shared territory they claim.
These elements help us distinguish gangs from more casual groups of young people.
Yeah, that distinction is important. The structure and the consistent involvement in illegal activities are really what set them apart. And the territorial aspect becomes particularly important when we start thinking about how gang dynamics might play out in a setting like a school.
Exactly. And something really concerning was that the mid-90s saw a shift towards gangs that were more violent, more involved in drugs, and more likely to use weapons compared to gangs in previous decades.
An escalation.
This escalation in violence and the link to drug activity obviously raised the stakes significantly, not just for the gang members themselves, but for the safety of the communities they were in, and potentially for schools as well.
Parks then highlights a crucial difference between normal adolescent peer groups and gangs. While all teenagers tend to form groups, gangs are characterized by that routine involvement in illegal activities, a deliberate nature to those actions, the claiming of turf, and a more developed leadership structure, as the work of Huff also indicated.
So it's not just hanging out.
Right. It's that commitment to illegal behavior and the more formal organization that distinguishes a gang from just a group of friends. And when they start claiming turf, that's when you see the potential for conflict and violence, especially if those territories overlap, as we saw with Miller's findings about schools.
Right. Miller's important study in the early 1980s actually found an increase in gang activity within schools, which was a significant change from the idea that schools were a neutral space.
Yeah, the neutral zone was disappearing.
Longers echoed this, calling the expansion of gang territory into schools a very disturbing trend. For you, this loss of the neutral zone status means that the conflicts and power dynamics of the outside world were increasingly being brought directly into the school environment, potentially putting all students and staff at risk.
So let's look more closely at these trends in school-related gang behavior as they were understood in the early to mid-1990s. There was a clear upward trend in violence in the U.S. overall during that time,
Yeah, crime was generally up.
and a noticeable increase in violent activity, specifically within schools, including incidents of homicide, rape, assaults, and the presence of weapons.
Scary stuff.
And as Parks mentioned earlier, these are likely underestimates. Fear of retaliation or negative public reaction could easily have led to incidents being underreported, especially when gangs were involved.
Right, the underreporting issue again?
So the official numbers might not have fully reflected what was really happening.
But here's another point that might surprise you.
Yeah.
The majority of juvenile crime was not connected to gangs.
Interesting.
Parks cites research by Ingersoll and Miller, who suggested that gangs represented a relatively small percentage of young people who were breaking the law.
Okay.
And gang fights, while certainly concerning, accounted for only a small fraction of all homicides. This really challenges that widespread idea that gangs were the primary drivers of all youth crime.
So it puts it in perspective.
It suggests that while gang violence was a serious problem, it's important to keep it in perspective and recognize the broader context of juvenile delinquency. And again, the media's role in potentially overemphasizing gang violence comes up.
Yeah, the media narrative.
It seems that focusing on the more dramatic cases might have created a distorted picture of the overall situation.
Law enforcement agencies did report that a significant portion of their crime index was linked to youth gangs, around 23%, according to a survey by Spergel.
Okay, almost a quarter.
However, they didn't break down how much of that reported crime actually occurred within school settings.
That's key.
That lack of specific data for schools makes it difficult to really understand the impact of gangs in that particular environment based solely on law enforcement statistics.
There were reports of physical assaults and robberies targeting teachers and students, but school authorities often suggested that many of the perpetrators were non-student intruders,
Right, outsiders.
meaning dropouts or older individuals who used to be involved with the school and might still see it as part of their territory or as a place to operate. This points to the fact that the school environment isn't always sealed off from outside influences.
Interestingly, more recent case studies by Spergel, around the time of Parks' review, didn't highlight school violence as a primary focus of activity for the gangs he was studying. That again suggests that while gangs might have a presence in schools, their main activities and conflicts might have been centered elsewhere in the community.
However, Parks emphasizes that evidence of gang behavior in schools did exist, and might have been on the rise in the mid-90s.
Okay, so it was happening.
She outlined specific ways Miller found this happening, including gangs operating at all levels of schooling, even in elementary schools, which was seen as a concerning development point.
Elementary school, wow.
The fact that gang activity was starting at such a young age suggests a deep-rooted issue. Miller also noted assaults on teachers and shootings of students, both gang members and those not involved inside schools, as well as gang fights and damage to school property.
Yeah.
Just the fact that gang members were attending school and that schools increasingly felt the need for special security measures like police officers and metal detectors was seen as a significant indicator of the problem's impact, even if gangs weren't the sole cause of all school violence.
Miller also highlighted other challenges schools were facing, such as disrespect towards teachers, a climate of gang terrorism that made discipline difficult, vandalism, the wearing of gang colors as a form of intimidation,
Yeah, colors and signs.
recruitment of new members within the school, racial tensions linked to gang affiliations, the increasing severity of violence, and even instances of principals trying to hide the extent of the problem due to threats.
That paints a really difficult picture for school administrators trying to maintain order and a safe learning environment.
And a new and troubling form of gang activity was emerging: protection and ownership rackets within schools.
Extortion.
Gang members were essentially extorting money from other students in exchange for protection, for permission to move around in certain areas, and for using school facilities in gang-controlled zones, effectively extending their turf inside the school walls.
That's a really insidious development, turning the school itself into a site for criminal activity and further disrupting the educational environment for everyone.
Martin and his colleagues also looked at both the indirect ways, like intimidation leading to students skipping school, and the direct ways, such as recruitment, holding meetings, undermining school policies, and committing criminal acts that gang violence impacted schools.
Right. Direct and indirect effects.
Interestingly, in their study, they found that gang violence was actually the least common type of reported violent incident.
Really? Least common.
That finding, again, points to the complexity of the issue. While gang violence is definitely a problem, it might not be the most frequent type of violence occurring in schools.
And Gannon Simonillo reported disturbing cases of students being attacked simply for following school rules or doing well academically, which contributed to dropout rates.
That's awful. Attacked for succeeding.
They even suggested that a significant portion of dropouts in Philadelphia at the time were driven by fear of gang attacks. That's a devastating consequence, where students are being punished for trying to succeed, and it shows the really negative influence gangs can have on the overall academic atmosphere.
Yeah.
Harutunian also noted that schools were being used by gangs as bases for all sorts of illegal activities, recruiting new members, selling drugs, carrying out extortion and robberies, and holding gang meetings.
So the school becomes a hub.
It reinforces the idea that for some gang members, the school had become an extension of their operations outside of school.
Now let's shift our focus to the reasons behind why young people join gangs and why gang violence occurs in schools. Parks points out that even by the mid-1990s, the underlying causes for the growth of gangs and their involvement in schools weren't fully understood.
Still figuring it out.
It's a really complex issue without a single, simple explanation. Researchers were exploring different psychological and social factors, but a clear and comprehensive understanding was still lacking. For you, this highlights the fact that there's no easy answer to why this happens.
Spergel noted that there wasn't much research comparing the psychological makeup of young people in gangs versus those from the same background who weren't in gangs.
Yeah, the comparison group.
While some theories suggested that things like a tendency towards violence or a confused sense of identity might draw youth to gangs, no specific personality type was consistently found to predict gang involvement.
So no gang personality.
This suggests that the environment and social context likely play a bigger role than just individual personality traits in determining who gets involved in gangs.
Yablonsky, as Parks mentions, proposed that young people with sociopathic tendencies might be more likely to develop in disorganized environments where there isn't much structure or nurturing support.
The environment enabling certain traits.
That highlights how the breakdown of societal structures can impact individual behavior and make young people more vulnerable to negative influences.
But ultimately, Parks emphasizes that a combination of factors is likely at play. The school environment itself, family dynamics, the community setting, and various individual risk factors.
It's multi-causal.
Let's look at how the school environment might contribute. Some researchers suggested that negative behaviors from teachers, things like name-calling, humiliating students, and having low expectations for certain students, could actually push them towards gangs where they might find a sense of belonging and support.
Wow, teachers contributing.
A study by Padilla with Chicano gang members really illustrated this. That's a powerful insight for you to consider how the adults in a school setting can unintentionally contribute to the problem.
And Huff's research found an interesting link between teacher behavior and safety. He found that teachers who were firm but also fair in their expectations were less likely to be assaulted by gang members,
Firm but fair.
while teachers perceived as weak might be more vulnerable. He even noted that in his study, no gang member reported assaulting a teacher who insisted on academic performance, but also showed they cared about the students.
That's fascinating. Respect matters.
That suggests that respect, even within a gang context, is often tied to perceived fairness and genuine care, rather than just being lenient.
It was also suggested that school administrators themselves could unintentionally contribute to problems through things like arbitrary rules, unfair ways of enforcing those rules, teachers who didn't seem to care, and overly large class sizes,
Systemic issues.
which could lead to frustration and resentment among students. Systemic issues within the school structure itself can create an environment where some students feel marginalized and might be more likely to seek out alternative social structures like gangs.
There was also the idea of a mismatch between school and society, as Wenck put it. The argument was that if school programs and curricula weren't relevant to the realities of the modern world, it could lead to students becoming disengaged, acting out, and eventually dropping out,
Making them more vulnerable.
making them more vulnerable to gang influence. And practices within schools like labeling students, tracking them into different academic levels, and segregation were also cited as potential factors that could contribute to violence and gang activity by creating feelings of alienation and inequality.
Surprisingly, even court-ordered busing, which was intended to address racial segregation in schools, was suggested as a factor that might have inadvertently worsened gang issues in some cases.
Oh, unintended consequences.
By forcing members of rival gangs to attend the same schools for the first time.
Yeah.
That's a really unintended consequence to think about an effort to solve one problem, potentially creating new challenges.
Yeah, complex interactions.
Of course, there was also disagreement on whether schools were a primary cause of youth violence or simply a reflection of problems that originated elsewhere in society.
Now, let's consider the role of family. Research consistently pointed to low family cohesiveness, poor parental monitoring of children's activities, and ineffective discipline as key factors in predicting which young people might become involved in violence in general.
The home environment.
And that gangs often provided a sense of emotional support for young people who lacked it at home. This reinforces for you the idea that what happens outside of school is a critical piece of the puzzle.
Definitely.
In fact, some research suggested that family factors were actually more significant than school-related factors in predicting a child's behavior.
More significant than school. Interesting.
Young people who got into trouble often came from homes where there wasn't enough supervision, where discipline was either too harsh or inconsistent, and where there wasn't a strong sense of family connection. This highlights that efforts to address gang involvement need to look beyond the school gates and consider the broader social and family contexts.
The community environment also plays a vital role. Negative experiences within the community, at school, and within the family were all seen as contributing to the formation of gangs,
Yeah, all connected.
including things of feeling like an outsider, racial tensions, failing in school, being absent from school a lot, and weak family ties. When these normal social controls that help guide young people fail, they might turn to gangs as an alternative source of structure and belonging.
A breakdown of the social fabric.
It's a breakdown of the overall social fabric that can allow gangs to take hold.
Research by Horowitz in a Chicano community showed the complex ways that gang members weren't necessarily complete outsiders, but could be integrated into the community in various ways.
Not always outsiders.
Often with unwritten rules about when and where gang activity was considered acceptable. Interestingly, open violence that disrupted the community's norms was often not tolerated, even by gang members themselves.
That illustrates that the relationship between gangs and the communities they exist in isn't always straightforward.
Right. Curry and Thomas argued that the gang problem is fundamentally a community-level issue, rooted in communities that are disorganized, meaning they have a lot of conflict and weak community institutions, or differentially organized, where there are strong criminal opportunities because of a lack of communication between key social institutions.
So community structures matter a lot.
This emphasizes the need for solutions that involve the whole community working together.
Finally, let's talk about young people who are most at risk. Parks highlights that poor young males of color, particularly African American and Hispanic youth, were identified as being at the highest risk of gang involvement.
Yeah, the demographics mentioned earlier.
The absence of positive male role models in families headed by single mothers was noted, with gangs sometimes acting as a surrogate extended family that met needs for belonging, nurturing, and acceptance.
Filling a void.
That lack of positive support systems can make the allure of gang membership particularly strong for vulnerable young men.
The emergence of Asian youth gangs was also mentioned, noting that they might have different structures and ways of operating compared to other gangs potentially being older, more secretive, and possibly more connected to organized crime.
Different dynamics.
The need for more research in this area was already being recognized back then. The diversity within the gang landscape itself is an important thing to remember.
Age is also a significant factor, with gang recruitment sometimes starting at a very young age, even in elementary school.
Yeah, we mentioned that. Shocking.
Within gangs, there's often an age-based hierarchy, with different names for younger and older members. Huff warned against labeling young people who might be on the fringes as gang members too early, as this could actually push them further into that life.
The self-fulfilling prophecy.
Early intervention and prevention efforts are clearly crucial, given how young some individuals become involved.
Girls in gangs were historically often seen as female auxiliary groups to male gangs. However, research by Campbell highlighted that for girls in gangs, there was often a strong sense of camaraderie and mutual support, though they were still largely connected to male gangs.
Sisterhood, almost.
Girls joined for reasons similar to boys seeking a sense of belonging, status, and protection, and sometimes as a way to rebel against community expectations. This was noted as an area that needed more research to understand their specific experiences.
Recognizing the specific experiences and motivations of girls in gangs is vital for developing effective interventions that address their unique needs.
And perhaps surprisingly to some, gang activity was also reported to be growing among white youth in suburban and small-town areas.
Right, not just an urban issue.
One possible explanation was the newcomer syndrome, where young people moving from inner cities might influence youth in these areas. More profitable drug markets in the suburbs and less intense law enforcement presence were also potential contributing factors.
Okay, interesting theories.
Underreporting of white youth gang involvement was suspected, possibly due to traditional definitions of gangs and different ways law enforcement might handle these situations. This suggests that gang activity wasn't solely an inner city or minority issue.
So, with this understanding of the problem as it was viewed in the mid-90s, what strategies were being suggested to address gang behavior in schools? Parks points out that there weren't many specific programs aimed at preventing gang activity in schools.
Yeah, mostly generic stuff.
Most were general programs for dealing with youth misbehavior.
Mm.
And Spergel noted that there wasn't much clear evidence about what actually worked when it came to tackling youth gang problems in general.
Not much proof of effectiveness.
The fact that gangs continued to grow suggested that past efforts hadn't been very successful.
Miller outlined several reasons why previous interventions might have fallen short, including a lack of an overall comprehensive strategy, no consistent national approach, weak connections between the theories about why gangs form and the programs designed to address them,
Theory versus practice gap.
poor evaluation of whether programs were actually working, a lack of sufficient resources, no central place to share information about effective programs, and a failure to really consider the broader social context in which gangs exist.
Basically, a lack of coordination and depth.
This highlights the need for a more joined-up and thoughtful approach.
Parks, drawing on a model called Precede-Proceed, which basically looks at the factors that lead to a problem, what helps it happen, and what keeps it going, to then suggest ways to intervene at each level, categorize potential strategies.
Okay, breaking it down.
For what are called predisposing factors, things like age, sex, race, socioeconomic status, there was a focus on providing strong male mentoring and responsibility programs for young African American and Hispanic males, particularly younger ones who might be at risk of joining gangs.
Mentorship, role models.
These programs would emphasize positive values like honor and respect and offer alternatives like recreation and youth employment. Strategies for doing well in school were also seen as important, as were violence prevention programs tailored to specific cultural and gender needs. Early intervention in elementary school to help children resist gang pressure was also highlighted, focusing on smaller groups of at-risk kids and programs specific to the stage of gang involvement.
Starting young.
And Huff even proposed some big-picture solutions, like improving socioeconomic status through full employment, targeted youth services, and early childhood education programs like Head Start. These types of strategies aim to address the underlying motivations that might make gang life appealing.
For enabling strategies, things that modify the environment, the focus was on changing the school and community settings. This included making school curricula more relevant to different cultures, hiring more staff of color, especially male role models, having higher academic expectations for all students, providing better teacher training, and offering more after-school
It's
activities.
school reform, basically.
In-school programs where gang members could learn to mediate disputes under the supervision of counselors showed some initial positive results.
Mediation, interesting.
Community-wide efforts to support students, parents, and schools, and getting the community to come together and agree on how to define the problem and form advisory groups were also seen as powerful.
Old community approach.
The religious community was identified as a potentially underutilized resource given its reach and community connections. And perhaps crucially, addressing racism was seen as essential, both in recognizing its role in gang issues and in the experiences of children of color in schools.
Tackling racism head-on.
This included training for school staff to address both overt and subtle forms of racism to create a better school atmosphere and reduce violence, and developing culturally relevant violence prevention programs that acknowledge the impact of racism. These enabling strategies aim to make it easier for young people to make positive choices by changing their surroundings and the opportunities available to them.
Then there were reinforcing strategies, which focused on involving parents, families, and teachers. This included teaching parents how to monitor their children's behavior, manage anger without violence, resolve conflicts peacefully, use effective discipline, and regulate media consumption.
Parental skills training.
Getting parents more involved in their children's education was also key, as was helping parents recognize and address if their child was getting involved in gangs.
Yeah, addressing denial.
For teachers, training needed to go beyond just classroom management to include how to connect with at-risk students, understand different cultures, be more sensitive, listen actively, and communicate effectively across cultures.
Broader teacher skills.
These skills were seen as crucial for preventing gang behavior and helping to turn around the lives of individual students. These reinforcing strategies aim to strengthen the positive influences in a young person's life by providing consistent support and guidance from the adults around them.
Parks also emphasizes the need for collaborative efforts that bring together all these different levels of intervention. Earlier work by Haratunian had shown that while many attempts had been made to address school violence, there was a lack of truly integrated approaches that worked on multiple levels and involved different disciplines.
Need for integration.
There was also a call for a coordinated campaign against media portrayals that glamorized violence, especially given the potential influence on young children and poor young males of color. A united front across different sectors is really needed to tackle this kind of complex problem.
Finally, both Miller and Huff called for significant reform. Miller argued for a specific national commitment to prevent and control youth crime, with a dedicated planning body that could develop creative programs, be flexible, and carefully evaluate what worked.
A national strategy.
Huff went even further, stating that gangs were really a symptom of deeper socioeconomic problems, like inequality and social injustice, and that failing to address these underlying issues would be a form of malignant neglect with serious consequences for society.
Addressing the root causes.
Their calls for reform underscore the idea that individual programs alone aren't enough. We need to look at the bigger picture.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into how gang behavior in U.S. schools was understood in the mid-1990s, it's clear that the relationship between gangs and school violence was more complicated than simple headlines might suggest.
Definitely more nuanced.
While gang presence in schools was definitely a reality with its own set of challenges and concerning trends, the research at the time didn't strongly support the idea that gangs were the primary cause of all violence in schools.
Right, not the main driver.
What really stands out is the limited amount of research specifically focused on what was happening with gangs inside schools, the ongoing difficulties in even defining what a gang is, and the wide range of factors from the school environment and family dynamics to community influences and individual vulnerabilities that seem to play a role in both gang formation and any related violence that might spill into schools. It suggests that simplistic solutions were unlikely to be effective.
Absolutely. It really emphasizes the importance of looking beyond the sensationalized stories
Hmm.
and trying to get a more accurate understanding of the complexities involved if we want to develop strategies that will actually make a difference.
Yeah.
This review from the mid-90s paints a picture that's full of nuances and raises a lot of important questions.
And that brings us to a final thought for you. Considering the many societal factors and even aspects of the school environment itself that can contribute to gang formation, what might be some of the less obvious ways that we, as a society, could be unintentionally perpetuating these issues?
Good question.
And what more fundamental shifts in our communities and institutions might be necessary to create truly long-term solutions? It's definitely something to keep in mind and explore further in your own thinking.